In the summer of 1985, a 30-year-old man drove out of a company campus in Cupertino, California, for what everyone assumed would be the last time. He had co-founded that company in a garage 9 years earlier. He had turned it into one of the most talked-about technology businesses in the world, and the board of directors he had helped assemble had just voted to strip him of any meaningful role and hand control of his own creation to someone else. The newspapers covered it like a funeral. Industry analysts wrote him off. Friends and colleagues were not sure what to say. And Steve Jobs, by his own later admission, did not know what came next either. What actually came next was 12 years of transformation so complete, so deep, so fundamentally reorienting that when Jobs walked back into Apple in 1997, he was not the same person who had left. He was something more dangerous. This is the real story of the greatest comeback in business history, and it is far more complicated, far more painful, and far more instructive than most people realize. To understand why the firing happened, you have to understand who Steve Jobs actually was in 1985, not the mythologized version that came later, but the real, difficult, often genuinely infuriating person he was at that moment in time. Jobs had co-founded Apple with Steve Wozniak and Ronald Wayne in 1976, and from the beginning he operated with a certainty about his own vision that people around him found both inspiring and exhausting in roughly equal measure. He was not a programmer. He was not an engineer in the technical sense. What he was, from the very beginning, was someone with an almost frightening ability to see what a product needed to feel like before any of the technical work had been done, and an equally frightening willingness to push the people around him past every limit they thought they had, until the product matched the vision in his head. The Apple II, which Wozniak largely designed, became one of the first genuinely successful personal computers and made Apple a real company. But Jobs was already looking ahead, already convinced that the next thing needed to be something qualitatively different, not just a better computer, but a computer that anyone could use without needing technical knowledge. This conviction led him toward the Macintosh project, which had actually been started by another Apple engineer named Jeff Raskin before Jobs essentially took it over, redirected it according to his own vision, and made it the center of his creative and professional identity. The Macintosh launched in January 1984 with one of the most famous television commercials ever made, a 60-second spot directed by Ridley Scott that ran during the Super Bowl and was designed to position Apple as a revolutionary force against the conformity represented by IBM. The ad worked as a cultural moment. The Macintosh itself, while genuinely innovative in ways that would influence computing for decades, did not sell as well as the company needed it to in its first year. Jobs had made promises about sales figures that the product did not meet. He had also made himself, by this point, genuinely difficult to work with in ways that went beyond creative intensity into something more disruptive. Engineers who worked under him in this period have described an environment where praise and devastating criticism arrived unpredictably, where Jobs would declare something brilliant one day and terrible the next, where the certainty of his vision was matched by a volatility in how he expressed it that wore people down over time. John Sculley, who Jobs had personally recruited from Pepsi with the famous question about whether Sculley wanted to spend the rest of his life selling sugar water or come change the world, was now Apple's CEO. The relationship between Jobs and Sculley deteriorated through 1985, as it became clear that their visions for the company's direction were incompatible. Jobs attempted to organize a move that would have sidelined Sculley. Sculley found out, took the situation to the board, and the board made its decision. Jobs was removed from the Macintosh division and given a role so empty of actual responsibility that it was functionally meaningless. He resigned shortly after and walked out of Apple for what most people assumed would be the last time. Here is what most people skip over when they tell this story. The period between 1985 and 1997 was not simply a gap between two successful chapters. It was where the actual transformation happened, the part of the story that explains everything that came after. And it was not comfortable. Jobs spent real money, made real mistakes, and spent real years building things that did not work the way he hoped before he found his footing again. The first thing he did after leaving Apple was start a new computer company called Next. The premise was that he would build a workstation aimed at the higher education market, a machine powerful enough for serious scientific and academic computing, beautiful enough to reflect his design sensibilities, and sophisticated enough to run software that existing university computers could not handle. Jobs raised money from investors, hired engineers, and began building Next with the same demanding standards he had applied at Apple. The hardware that eventually emerged was genuinely striking, a perfect black cube that looked unlike anything else in the computer market at the time. The software was technically impressive in ways that would matter enormously years later. But Next struggled commercially in ways that were painful and public. The machine was expensive, significantly more expensive than competing workstations. The software ecosystem was limited. Universities were interested but often not able to justify the cost. Next went through years of difficult sales, significant losses, and had to eventually abandon its hardware ambitions entirely, pivoting to become a software company selling its operating system rather than the computers it ran on. For a man with Jobs' competitive drive and public profile, this period was genuinely humbling. He had left Apple under circumstances that had been covered extensively and unfavorably in the press. He was now running a company that was struggling to find its commercial footing, while his former creation, Apple, continued without him. But here's what was actually happening during those difficult next years, and this is the part of the story that matters most for understanding what came after. Jobs was learning things he could not have learned at Apple, things that the speed and visibility and success of his 20s had never required him to confront. He was learning what it felt like to build a product that the market did not immediately embrace. He was learning the difference between being right about a vision and being right about the timing and pricing and market positioning that would actually allow a vision to succeed. He was learning, slowly and painfully, that his instincts about design and technology were genuinely excellent, but that his instincts about how to lead and manage people needed serious refinement if he was going to build something that lasted. He was also making an investment that most people around him considered a distraction from Next's struggles. In 1986, Jobs purchased a small computer graphics division from filmmaker George Lucas for $5 million and invested an additional $5 million to keep it running. That division was called Pixar. The team at Pixar was working on computer animation technology that Jobs found interesting, but it was not obvious at the time that this small studio in Richmond, California, was going to become one of the most valuable creative companies in the world. For years, Pixar was primarily a technology company, selling graphics hardware and software to the film and medical imaging industries, not a film studio. Jobs kept it alive through losses that cost him, by some accounts, more than $50 million of his own money before the company found its direction. The direction came through an unlikely source. John Lasseter, a young animator who had been hired from Disney and was one of the most creatively talented people at Pixar, had been making short animated films to demonstrate what the company's technology could do. These shorts were technically impressive, but more importantly, they were emotionally resonant in ways that pure technology demonstrations rarely achieve. Lasseter had a gift for using computer animation to tell genuinely moving stories, and Jobs recognized what this meant for Pixar's future in a way that eventually led to a deal with Disney to produce a full-length computer-animated feature film. That film was Toy Story, released in November 1995, and it became both a massive commercial success and a genuine cultural moment. When Pixar went public shortly after Toy Story's release, the stock offering made Jobs a billionaire almost overnight, providing him with the kind of financial security and public validation that his years running Next had not. But more important than the money was what the Pixar experience had taught Jobs about how extraordinary creative work actually gets made. At Pixar, Jobs was not the primary creative force. Lasseter and the animation team were. Jobs' role was to protect the creative environment, to make the business decisions that gave the creative team the resources and time they needed, and to resist pressures that would have compromised the work in exchange for short-term commercial considerations. This was a genuinely different role than the one he had played at Apple in his 20s, where his creative vision was itself the product. At Pixar, he learned what it meant to serve someone else's creative vision, to be the person who made the conditions for great work possible, rather than the person whose individual taste defined what great work looked like. He was not always perfect at this, even at Pixar. He made decisions that Lasseter and others had to push back against. But he was learning, in a context where the stakes were real and the feedback was direct, what great leadership of creative people actually required. That education would prove invaluable when he returned to Apple. Apple, meanwhile, had spent the 12 years after Jobs' departure struggling in ways that were increasingly visible and alarming. The company had released many products, launched multiple initiatives, spent enormous amounts of money on projects that went nowhere, and had gone through multiple CEOs without finding a coherent strategic direction. By 1996, Apple was losing money, losing market share, and was widely discussed in the technology press as a company that might not survive. The product line had expanded to the point of incoherence, with multiple versions of the same computer being sold simultaneously at different price points with minimal, meaningful differentiation. The culture had fragmented. The sense of purpose that had defined the early Apple years under Jobs had dissipated into something much more ordinary and directionless. The board's decision to acquire Next in December 1996 was driven primarily by a need for modern software to power Apple's next generation of computers. Next's operating system, which had been technically sophisticated from the beginning, was exactly what Apple needed. Jobs came back as part of the deal, initially in an advisory role. Within months, he had effectively taken control, and in September 1997, he was named Interim CEO, a title that would eventually drop the interim after the board accepted that there was no realistic alternative. What Jobs did in his first 2 years back at Apple has been studied, analyzed, and written about extensively. But it is worth going through the specifics because the decisions he made reveal something important about how he had changed during his time away. The first thing he did was cut. Not modestly cut, but radically cut. Apple's product line was reduced from dozens of models to essentially 4, organized around a simple 2x2 grid of consumer versus professional and desktop versus portable. Everything else was discontinued. The projects, the partnerships, the licensing arrangements that had allowed other companies to make Mac clones, all of it was stripped away to expose the core of what Apple actually needed to be. This required saying no to things that had existing customers, existing revenue, existing teams of people whose jobs depended on them. It required accepting short-term disruption in exchange for long-term clarity. The Jobs of 1985 had the instincts to make these kinds of decisions, but not always the discipline to execute them without creating unnecessary collateral damage in the process. The Jobs of 1997, shaped by 12 years of failure and learning and watching Pixar build something extraordinary through clarity of purpose, could do both. The iMac, released in August 1998, was the first product that showed the world what the returning Jobs' Apple was going to look like. The machine was housed in a translucent blue and white case designed by Jony Ive, a British designer who had joined Apple in 1992, and whose sensibility aligned with Jobs' in ways that would define Apple's aesthetic for the next 2 decades. The iMac was not the most technically advanced computer available. It was the most beautiful, the most approachable, the most carefully considered piece of consumer technology that had been released in years. It sold extremely well, and more importantly, it signaled clearly to the market, to customers, to the technology press, and to Apple's own employees that something had genuinely changed at the company. But if the iMac was the signal, the iPod was the proof. Released in October 2001, the iPod entered a market that already had portable digital music players and found a way to make the entire category feel new. The device held 1,000 songs, which was genuinely impressive, but the actual breakthrough was the experience of using it. the scroll wheel that allowed navigation through thousands of songs with a single finger, the tight integration with iTunes software on the Mac, the simple, fast synchronization that made getting music onto the device feel effortless rather than technical. These were not accidents of engineering. They were the results of Jobs' obsessive focus on the end-to-end user experience, on every moment of interaction between a person and a product, rather than just on the specifications that appeared on a product review checklist. The iTunes Music Store, launched in 2003, completed the picture by solving a problem that neither the music industry nor the technology industry had been able to solve satisfactorily on their own. Digital music was already being shared illegally at enormous scale, and the music industry was losing billions as a result. Jobs negotiated with the major labels, using his reality distortion field to convince executives who were deeply skeptical of selling individual songs for 99 cents each, and built a legal distribution system that was simple enough, cheap enough, and well-designed enough to convince millions of people to pay for music they could have stolen. This was not primarily a technology achievement. It was a negotiation achievement, a marketing achievement, and a user experience achievement. It required the combination of skills that Jobs had spent 12 years developing. The iPhone, announced in January 2007, is the product most people think of when they think of Jobs' return to Apple. And there is a reason for that. The iPhone did not simply improve on existing smartphones. It redefined what a smartphone was supposed to be. The decision to use a touchscreen that filled the entire front face of the device to eliminate the physical keyboard that every previous smartphone had considered essential, to build the software from the ground up around touch interaction rather than adapting existing mobile software to a new input method, these were choices that required exactly the kind of conviction Jobs had demonstrated throughout his career. Multiple technology executives looked at early touchscreen phones before the iPhone and concluded that customers would not accept a device without a physical keyboard. Jobs concluded the opposite, and turned out to be right in a way that reshaped the entire mobile technology industry within a few years. The App Store, launched in 2008, extended what the iPhone was by turning it into a platform that millions of developers could build on. Within years, the App Store had generated an entirely new industry of mobile software development, created wealth for thousands of independent developers, and made the iPhone something that continued getting more valuable the longer someone used it, because the library of software available for it kept growing. This was platform thinking at its most powerful, and it transformed Apple from a hardware company that sold phones into something much more durable and defensible. Jobs was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2003, a fact that was not publicly known for some time, and that he managed with a combination of medical treatment and, by some accounts, initial reluctance to pursue more aggressive intervention that he later expressed regret about. He took medical leave multiple times in his later years at Apple, and was visibly physically diminished in his final public appearances. He resigned as CEO in August 2011, naming Tim Cook, who had been running Apple's operations brilliantly for years, as his successor. Jobs died in October 2011, at 56 years old. The legacy he left behind is easier to measure in some ways than in others. Apple became the most valuable company in the world by market capitalization, a position it held for years after his death. The products he had shepherded back to Apple, the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, the MacBook line, reshaped entire industries and created categories that did not previously exist. But the harder-to-measure legacy may be more important. Jobs demonstrated that design, in the deepest sense of the word, the deliberate shaping of how something works and feels and fits into a person's life, could be a genuine source of competitive advantage in the technology industry, not just a surface coating applied to engineering decisions made on other grounds. He also demonstrated something about the relationship between failure and growth that is worth taking seriously. The Steve Jobs who was fired in 1985 was genuinely talented, but also genuinely difficult in ways that created real problems for the organizations he led. The Steve Jobs who returned in 1997 had been broken and rebuilt by 12 years of experience that included things that did not work, investments that nearly cost him everything, and a patient collaboration with people at Pixar whose creative gifts complemented his own in ways that taught him what great leadership of creative people actually required. He was not transformed into a saint. People who worked with him in his second Apple era will tell you he remained demanding, intense, and occasionally brutal in his assessments. But he had developed the judgment and the self-awareness to channel those qualities more effectively toward building things that mattered. The question worth sitting with as this story closes is not what you would have done in Jobs' position, though that is worth asking. The more interesting question is this: what period in your own life, the period you most wish had gone differently, the failure or the setback, or the years when nothing seemed to be working, might actually be the period that is building whatever comes next? Because if Jobs' story teaches anything, it is that the wilderness years, the years of difficulty and uncertainty and apparent failure, are not simply a gap between successful chapters. They are often where the most important work gets done. Subscribe to Billion Dollar Stories right now if this kind of deep dive into the real decisions behind extraordinary lives is what you are looking for. Leave a comment below telling me which part of Jobs' story you found most surprising, whether it was the next years, the Pixar investment, or something else entirely. Like this video if you made it all the way to the end, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story right now. We will see you in the next one.